This is really exciting energy. I'm really happy that that break was an extended break, right? I used to be early for things, and now that I have a child and a dog, I'm late for everything. So this is really good. So welcome back. And I would like to welcome Alan Corbiere, who will give our first presentation. But first, a bit about Alan. Alan Ujig Corbiere, B'nai Dodom, Ruffed Grouse Clan, is Anishinaabe from Michiging First Nation on Manitoulin Island. He was educated on the reserve and then attended the University of Toronto for a Bachelor's of Science. He then entered York University and earned his Master's of Environmental Studies. During his master's studies, Alan focused on Anishinaabe narrative and language revitalization. For 5 years, he served as the executive director at the Ojibwe Cultural Foundation in Michiging, a position which also encompassed the roles of curator and historian. Alan also served as the Anishinaabe Mawin Revitalization Program Coordinator at Lakeview School, where he and his team worked on a culturally based second language program that focused on using Anishinaabe stories to teach language. Alan has just earned his doctorate at York University, so I want to welcome Dr. Alan Corbiere. Thank you.
Nin sawajik beden dodem wedem chigging donjaba. Gitchinendam dash gibijaya mampi Archives of Ontario. Meanwhile dash chinendam dash wabmana wabmin kinawaya gibijayek mampi. Meanwhile dash ngakke nishnabem tawak gundak giota yaat atazokanak gadodemananak. Meanwhile ge Commission Sabananek, meanwhile Kokomis Sabananek, meanwhile Gunduk, Nishnabemjik, Wa Nishnabemjik, meanwhile Ga Nishnabemjik, Nisa Engine Nishnabemia, Nui Nishnabem Tawaka Gunduk, Nishnabemjik, meanwhile Wa Nishnabemjik, meanwhile Ga Nishnabemjik. So, what we meanwhile dash Nga Makwanama Gamakwanama Gunduk, Ganamajajik. Meanwhile, dash Minjaman Mak Gundak Wabayajik. So I too have to speak the little bit of language that I learned. Me wapigi guzenswiya gitsimak ensagijgak gi nishnabem tadawat. When I was a boy, my parents spoke to each other in Ojibwe every day. But then they turned to me and my siblings and they spoke English. And so I never picked it up at home. But I ingi non dan ensagijgak we nishna gede nishna bemwana. But every day I heard our language. So I decided to try and learn it, and that's why I try to speak it. And so I'm grateful nui mi gwechra mabanene ka bakanang manda nakwashkata ding. I'm grateful to that man who spoke and opened up this gathering. And the reason I go gi insastazin we kakatat. I don't understand. I didn't understand what he said. And to me, that's the beauty of it, because it reminds me of how our people, the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, would have met before. And that we didn't really understand each other's language, but we had people who actually were the interpreters who had to do that. So in order to make peace, we had to learn each other's way, and we had to learn each other's language and way of speaking. And I want to hopefully talk a bit about how this was done. So I also, like him, he spoke to all the creation, and then myself as well. What I had said is I want to keep in mind those that are yet to come, but I also want to remember the ones that have left. And I also want to speak that bit of that language for those that want to learn to speak our language, and then also the ones that do speak our language that live here currently, and then also the ones that spoke our language that have gone on, that lived here as well. So what we believe as Anishinaabe people, that we say, "Giotai Yawak Kunduk," they're all around here still. Those people that speak our language, our ancestors, and as well as those clans, we call them, as well as those Atsokanak, those spirits, we call them. Anyway, this is a letter, a broadside, and it's actually written in Ojibwe in what I would call the Methodist or Anglican orthography. So it's a bit more like how your English language is. The spelling is not the most consistent. And as opposed to if this were a French-inspired orthography, it would be more rigorous and easier for me to read. So I found this here a while ago, and I was inspired by it because I listened to a fellow named Chris Wolfhart, a linguist who works with Cree people. And he was talking about how when the treaties were made, the practice back then was actually to make sure that there were 3 copies of that in 3 different languages. So if there was a treaty between the German and the English, there would be a 3rd copy. There'd be a copy in English, there'd be a copy in German, and then there'd be a copy in French. So that if there were any dispute between the German and the English version, you would default to the French version of that treaty. So what he had said, this Chris Wolfhart, is by the time the treaties came out to the prairies, the Bible had long been translated, as well as other hymnals and other literature. He says, and the actual priest was the interpreter, and he wrote in his journal, "I went down to the lake to gather my thoughts on how I was going to translate this." And he says, where are his notes to this? And so that got me thinking, well, they had translators. And then here, this is actually written in 1866 by the government. And you see the King's Arms up there, the coat of arms. So they actually had the capacity to write our treaties in our language, but they never did. This is actually a proclamation that was posted at the church in Wikwemekong. And it says that after that treaty in 1862, the chiefs had expelled other chiefs that signed that 1862 treaty. And so when they expelled those chiefs, they said, "You go live on the ceded portion of the island. This is an unceded portion." And the government wrote back and said, "You cannot do that. You cannot expel people from your community, and you have to take them back in." So when it suited the government's purposes, of course, they wrote in our language. But when it didn't suit their purpose, they didn't write in our language, even though they had the capacity. So I was at a conference in Dartmouth, and we ended up publishing a book. All of the fellow presenters put together a book. I think it's called The Afterlives of Indigenous Archives. And in that, a lady named Ellen Cushman wrote an article in there about the Cherokee literacy. One of the things that I like that she wrote in there is the first thing she says is, this is a quote, "As soon as the word archive is used, it evokes 4 imperialist tenets of thought: tradition, collection, artifacts, preservation. These tenets of imperialist thought structure archives whether in material or digital form," end quote. So I've often thought of this, and this is why I chose this as the beginning slide, is that here it is about, this is a whole imperialist endeavor, in a sense, of collecting different information. And one of the things that I wanted to also start off or situate myself is that I was part of a court case. And last year, that court case wrapped up, and we won that court case, the Robinson-Huron Treaty Annuity case. It's called Restoule et al. Versus the Ontario and Canada. So Canada now accepted that we won, and they're ready to negotiate. And here, Ontario actually is appealing that court case. So I kind of stand here cognizant that I'm part of I'm addressing an arm of the Ontario government that is actually disputing our claims yet again. So the other fella in that book is a colleague of mine, Tom Peace, but he quotes Rodney Carter, and he says that Rodney Carter actually, the quote that he uses of Rodney Carter says, "Those marginalized by the state are marginalized by the archive." And then he continued further, and he says, "Archival violence is found in the use of documents to enforce and naturalize the state's power, and in the active silencing of the disenfranchised." So those are pretty blunt words, and I really identified with them. I was reading this book, that collection, even though you sit in these conferences and you take notes, and I rarely revisit my notes. But when it was actually published as a book, and my article chapter was in there, so I thought, well, I'll reread this, and then I found it good to revisit what the other scholars had been saying as well. So it was good to read that, and I've never been to this conference, and it's always kind of around the same time as the Algonquian conference. It's about the tribal libraries and archives conference that they have every year. So I've never made it out there yet, and there's a whole body of literature there to actually explore as well. And then another person that I really looked at and read, when I read her article, I also thought, well, okay, how am I going to address this in this talk? So it's Jennifer O'Neill, and her chapter was called "From Time Immemorial, Centering Indigenous Traditional Knowledge and Ways of Knowing in the Archival Paradigm." So her quote is, "Making these changes in the profession means recognizing historical Indigenous settler relationship that often governs these collections and revealing the relational power dynamics between Indigenous and Western science that permeates archival repositories today. Thus, we must recontextualize the historical narrative by placing Indigenous history and knowledge at the center of the archival paradigm," end quote. So the whole, I believe what part of the gathering here, purpose of this gathering is summarized in that statement. We must recontextualize the historical narrative by placing Indigenous history and knowledge at the center of the archival paradigm. And when I was asked maybe 4 months ago to come and talk here, I didn't know the actual questions. So I thought off and on throughout, I thought, how am I going to talk about this? And well, like many of you do a draft, then you do another one, and then you reflect on what you want to say and what's going on, and then of course it changes again. So I thought, well, I'll look at the website here of the conference, and I didn't actually see these. They must have emailed me them, but I just, you get so busy with your email that you just gloss over some of this stuff. So how have Indigenous communities engaged in archival practices and in memory work? I said, okay, I can try and answer that. What does an Indigenous archives look like? What does it do? What does the community need from their knowledge keepers, elders, and memory workers? So here's where I thought, okay, I'll try and deal with this a bit more. So Anishinaabe people, gundak getsi pichijik, gen wakajik, apane ekedowat. Our elders and our wise people always say our land is our history book, our land is our Bible. So, but we're in an archival institution that's actually using and preserving documents and other items. This is actually pictographs that are at the Agua Canyon, which is north of Sault Ste. Marie, northwest of Sault Ste. Marie in the Lake Superior Provincial Park. So there's a whole narrative that goes with this, but on your left are the actual pictures of the pictographs, and on the right is actually Henry Rowe Schoolcraft actually questioned a chief named Jigwakons, and that means Little Pine. And Little Pine described it and he etched it out, but then Schoolcraft got Eastman to repaint these and he published them. So on the bottom here, you see that those canoes and that bird, that's actually that top part. And then you see that man on a horse drawn there, and then you see it over on the your lower left. But what's interesting is how here that arc, and it has 3 discs in it, but actually on the actual pictograph, the arc is inverted and it has actually 4 discs. From what I understand, it's 4 moons, and here it's 3 moons. So it's interesting is, to me, then what this shows, why I'm showing this, is you got to go to the site. You can't just go to the book. And although this, of course, we all know that these things get mediated, this was taken down by the great chief Jigwakons, and he described it, and then it was drawn. But you see how it has been altered. This is actually the chief, Ojibwe chief, Jigwakons, and that means Little Pine, and he's a signatory to the 1850 treaty, and he was one of the main actual pushers behind it. And he was the one who was insisting on this escalator clause that the recent court case was about. And he was the one who successfully negotiated that annuity should increase if the province actually, or the government actually realized more profit and that they could increase it, that they should in their discretion. These are 2 of my kind of favorite quotes of his. In 1829, this was at St. Joseph's Island, and this is a historic site. At St. Joseph's Island, there was a council fire. And what they call a council fire is actually a fort. And this fort was the British garrison was stationed there, and they were to deliver warmth to the Anishinaabe. And when we say we were to receive warmth, it meant presents. And it meant cloth, blankets, gunpowder, ammunition, as well as what we say, shkode abo, rum. So here he's addressing the all in attendance there. And these gatherings would be attended by Ho-Chunk people, what you may know as Winnebago, Menominee people, Ojibwe, Odawak, Minoage, Bode Adamik. So the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and the Ojibwe and Potawatomi, Odawa people, as well as the Sioux people. And even some years after the War of 1812, the Sauk and Fox, like the great chief Black Hawk, came up there as well, but also Drummond Island. So he says, holding a few strings of wampum in his hand, and said, Father, the great master of life gave us pipes and wampum for the purpose of conveying our ideas from man to man. And then again, when he heard that these presents were going to be discontinued in 1852, that's when they heard the news. And he says, Father, we salute you. We beg of you to believe what we say, for though we cannot put down our thoughts on paper as you, our wampums and the records of our old men are as undying as your writings, and they do not deceive. So that one's probably my favorite quote. So the idea is that we have our own records, the records of our old men, and it's in wampum. He didn't mention birch bark scrolls, but that would be another. And then also what I'll talk about are pipes and pipe stems and how they were decorated, as well as other items that were decorated as well. So one of the things that I wanted to address was, what does an Indigenous archive look like? How was it stored? How was it cared for? And I'll see if I'm successful. These collars, this is a quote from Pierre de Charlevoix, when he wrote a journal of his voyage to North America. Quote, "These collars are carefully preserved," and collars in this case means wampum belts. The French called them collars, and I think that's more accurate translation than belts. "And not only compose part of the public treasures, but are likewise their registers or annals, and ought to be studied by those who have charge of their archives, which are deposited in the cabins of the chief," end quote. So it was the chief who kept the wampum belts in his wigwam, but here I believe he's actually talking about Haudenosaunee people. But again, the chief in a Haudenosaunee didn't have his own cabin. So it's unclear as if he's actually talking about a Haudenosaunee person or Anishinaabe or Huron. But here, this one I'll actually refer to as by a fellow named Peter Clark, who wrote his History of the Wendat people. Quote, "About this time, the king or head chief of the Wendat, Satstaratse, called a meeting at the house of Chief Adam Brown, who had charge of the archive for the purpose of overhauling them, which consisted of wampum belts, parchments, and the like, contained in a large trunk. One by one was brought out and showed to the assembled chiefs and warriors. Chief Brown wrote on a piece of paper and tacked it on each wampum belt, designating the compact or treaty it represented. After it had been explained from memory by the chiefs appointed for that purpose, there sat before them their venerable king, in whose head was stored the hidden contents of each wampum belt. Listening to the rehearsal and occasionally correcting the speaker and putting him on the right track whenever he deviated. Here was an accumulation of documents during a period of about 70 years, and which took them 2 or 3 days to examine and rearrange them all in proper order." So there's a number of things in this. One is that it's stored in a trunk. So I was actually going to put a big trunk on my slide here. But, and that doesn't sound very Aboriginal or Indigenous or whatever word you want to use now, native. The other part is that what I liked is, "Here sat before them their venerable king, in whose head was stored the hidden contents of each belt." So to me, this actually says that the archive is not only the physical, tangible objects. The archive is actually in the minds and hearts of the people who are trained to keep that. So, and then the other thing that's important in this is that they actually got together and brought them out, and that they put them in order. They all laid all those documents out, parchments and wampum belts, and read them to each other. And then the other significant thing is he then put a little piece of paper on each of them. So for our people, Anishinaabe people, the Odawa were entrusted with this covenant chain wampum belt of 1764 that was delivered at Niagara. And in 1852, the Reverend Hallen did a rubbing of this. He borrowed it from the Jean-Baptiste Siganak. And then what he noted was that attached to that wampum belt was ribbons as well as strings of hankered of wampum strings, but also a piece of paper. And on that paper, it said it had a number of names, and those names were the previous keepers of those belts. So the another point that I want to stress is we did start to incorporate writing into our archive as well, which to some people is people, like when I started doing this kind of work and I started interviewing elders and writing out what they're saying, transcribing what they're saying, translating what they're saying, a lot of people would come up to me and say, "You can't do that. You shouldn't do that. Our language is oral. We never used to write our language." But I found all these documents written in the mid-19th century, written in Ojibwe by the chiefs. So I keep telling people, yes, we did write in our language and we used what was at our disposal. So here is Peter Clark again. In 1842, when some of the Wendat had left Canada to join their nation in Ohio and to emigrate with them to Kansas the year following, the trunk containing the wampum belts and documents was left in the care of a member of the Wyandot band in Canada, who it was supposed intended to follow the emigration party. The trunk was sent to the Wyandots in Ohio, who took it with them to Kansas. In 1864, a member was authorized by the band to bring back what he could find of the then broken up archives and scattered documents which had been sent away from Canada in 1842. But he found only part of the wampum belts and some papers. Thus were broken up and scattered to the four winds the archives of the Wyandot nation. The archives were held, when entire, by the Wyandots in Canada as something sacred left to them by their forefathers, end quote. So here, what I omitted was that the Indian agent was George Ironside at that time, and he had a wife there, and their kid was George Ironside Jr., and he became the Indian agent as well. And he's the one that denied them. They wanted to bring that trunk with them, and he said, "No, we'll keep this." So what I'm trying to find out in our area as well is sometimes the chiefs actually were the ones that were keeping it, and then other times, sometimes for reasons of safety, it was kept in the Indian agent's house or safe as well. So this archive ends up through the interruption and the actions of the Indian agent that it gets dispersed all over. It's no longer kept in the trunk. And here, this is, again, I'll refer to Ellen Cushman here. So she says, quote, "If the first move in decolonizing the archive is to challenge Western understandings of time as a necessary underpinning for tradition, the second move takes up the problem of collecting artifacts. The actions involved in the collection of artifacts damage them in three ways. One, the item is taken out of its context of use. Two, it is no longer understood in relation to the stories that place the item in its context and in relation to the people who use it. And three, the people who would ostensibly have uses for the item are necessarily presumed to be no longer living," end quote. So again, this comes back to what the first quote of Rodney Carter about the archives, and that those marginalized by the state are marginalized by the archive, and that when it's all dispersed like that, and of course, many of you may have grown up after going to school thinking that the Huron are extinct. And so we have this whole narrative of extinction tied to the Huron-Wendat people as well. And of course, they are not extinct. This, at that point, what I've been talking about could be just the Huron-Wendat archives. But we were in alliance with them. The Ojibwe, the Odawa, and Potawatomi were their allies. So what we ended up calling them, we look at ourselves as Anishinaabe people, as Indigenous people, in terms of kinship. So Anishinaabe, the Odawa and Ojibwe and Potawatomi people look at themselves as three brothers. All say that the Potawatomi are the youngest, and then what the Odawa and Ojibwe kind of argue over is who's the oldest. And this kind of matters to us because the elders have presumably more wisdom and more rights to speak. Similarly, we called the Huron our uncles, and they were the uncles of the Western Confederacy. And then the Delaware and Munsee people, we called them our grandfathers. Even if they were younger than me, if there was a Delaware person here, and they were younger than me, I'd still call them my grandfather. So that's what how we looked at this as a big family on this, what we call Turtle Island. So here, this is the four nations now entered into an arrangement about their country. The Ojibwe, Wendat, Potawatomi, and Odawa to share the land. It was also decided that the Wyandot should be the keeper of the International Council Fire, the locality of which was to be figuratively represented by a column of smoke reaching to the skies and which was to be observed and acknowledged by all Indian nations in and around this part of North America. From that period might be dated the first introduction of the wampum belt system, representing an agreement among the four nations. The belt was left with the keepers of the Council Fire. From that time forward until the year of 1812, when the Council Fire was removed from Michigan to Canada, every wampum belt representing some international compact was placed in the archives of the Wyandot or Wendat nation. Each belt bore some mark denoting the nature of a covenant or contract entered into between the parties and hidden contents of which was kept in the memory of the chiefs. So here, Clark makes a footnote about the term council fire. And he says the term council fire in a general sense signified their international archives, which the Wyandots had charge of, and who, at the same time, were arbiters in their general council on any important question that may concern the whole of these combined, meaning all the nations. So here again, when there's any dispute, an arbiter in our language would be an uncle. He's the one who helped settle that dispute. And so, as well, the council fire is a many-layered metaphor in our indigenous thought and diplomacy. So here, the council fire actually can mean the physical fort, but it also can mean the archive and also the place where knowledge is sought. So the Anishinaabe people now, when we gather in a traditional form, we always have a fire. And we always offer tobacco to that. And then that, again, when he said that the column of smoke would go up, and that's that not only the smoke from the wood, but that's the prayers of the tobacco burning for us. So again, we have this sacred notion attached to fire and to council fire and to meeting. And then also, many of you might know that when we also gather, we'll feast. And then different types of feasts we do. One of the types of feasts is we'll put food in that fire for the deceased as well. So the other thing that I want to mention at this time is when the Treaty of Niagara, when the British gave us that wampum belt, from 1764 to 1854, they gave us these presents at Niagara, Detroit, Amherstburg, Fort Malden, and then Drummond Island, Penetanguishene, and Michilimackinac, as well as Manitowoc on Manitoulin Island from 1836 to 1854. But if you look at the requisition of presents there, tobacco is always on there. They knew enough to come when they met with us that they were to give us tobacco. So they always gave us tobacco as this place to change. So again, I have to reiterate O'Neill's charge, quote, "Thus we must recontextualize the historical narrative by placing Indigenous history and knowledge at the center of the archival paradigm," end quote. So what I'm trying to explain to you is how our archive worked, and what Peter Clark says, Doyen Teta says, is that the council fire is the archive. And it's also the memory of the chiefs that are there, as well as the physical items, the parchments, and the actual wampum. But to go further, to just make this very plain and explicit, is that they had yearly gatherings, or as near as a yearly gathering as they could, where they invited the different stakeholders as well. So that's why this gathering here is important, and I liked the opening remarks by the director here, Nagan Zikandang, what we would say, or Bapasan Dip, what we would say, the head of this place, when he said that they're here to listen, not to sell or what they have. So here, this is another fellow. His name is Thomas Forsyth, and he was an Indian agent with the Sauk and Fox from the 1820s up to 1830s, just before the breakout of the Black Hawk War. So what he says is, quote, "It is hard for me to say at this late day where and when the council fire originated. It existed at Old Chillicothe in the state of Ohio, And in 1783, the council fire was by unanimous consent removed to Fort Wayne, thence afterwards to the foot of the rapids of the Miami River of the Lakes, where it remained until 1796, when it was removed to Brownstown, where it now is. So Brownstown is just south of Detroit there. And hopefully this comes together, but I want to make you understand that Brownstown was set up by Adam Brown, who Peter Clark is talking about. That was the head chief there. And then afterward, what hopefully comes together as well is that what Brownstown is actually the council fire of the Western Confederacy, as opposed to the Confederacy or the council fire between the British and the Western Confederacy, which was actually at Amherstburg or Fort Malden. So I'll try and pull this all together. Between the years 1740 and 1751, the principal portion of the Wendat's had taken permanent possession of the country between Fort Detroit and the River Huron in Michigan. Their main village was at a place now called Gibraltar, and about opposite Amherstburg on the mainland, where they erected their council house. In this village was kept their archives and international council fire. So again, the two are almost synonymous, but he makes it explicit that it's the international archives and the council fire as well. So this is a belt that was collected from the Wendat, and it's got the Road of Peace, and it's got 3 diamonds representing 3 nations. And then this is another wampum belt, same collection, and it was collected by Horatio Hale, but these two are now at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, England. And just to emphasize the point that I don't know if these were the ones that were actually part of the international archives that Peter Clark is talking about, but it actually sounds like this top one is the four squares. But I won't talk about that. But it's the point is that these are now elsewhere, and that talking again about O'Neill's quote. I got 5 minutes already. Oh. That was a quick 40 minutes. So here, these are the different nations that were part of that archive, and they're listed here. So here, the British Confederacy with the Shawanoe, Delaware, Mingo, Wyandot, Chippewa, Odawa, and Potawatomi are an offensive and defensive members of this council fire. When any business is to be done that concerns the Confederacy, it must be done at this council fire where are assembled as many chiefs as can be conveniently collected. At any meeting this council fire, the British government is always represented by their Indian agent, and most generally accompanied by a military officer to represent the soldiers or braves. All Indians in forming alliances with each other select a central spot to meet every 2 or 3 years to commemorate and perpetuate their alliance. These alliances are strictly attended to by all parties concerned, and should there be any neglect to visit the council fire by deputies or otherwise to commemorate their alliance, it is considered as trifling with their allies. So basically, attendance to the council fire and the general council was mandatory, and if you didn't show up, it meant that you were kind of dissing the whole thing. So here, this is the same thing. When this is what I like to see here at this particular gathering, is that you got different people here that are from the communities that come to see what's actually here, and then to participate and to share. So the idea is that this would be a metaphorical council fire as well, where we're sharing information with each other. So the idea of meeting regularly with diverse, interested, invested groups remind me of another of Jennifer O'Neill's charges. She says, quote, respect and implement our traditional knowledge systems. So one of the most important actions in this process is to learn as much as possible about the community, their history, lifeways, traditions, and beliefs. This should always serve as your foundation, as each community is different and one requires different approaches to stewardship of its archive. So these are belts that may have been part of that, but some of these, like I said, the other 2 belts are at Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, England, and these ones are actually at the National Museum of the American Indian. And here, I wanted to just talk about that. I read Andrew Newman's book called On Records, and he talks about mnemonic communities as also discourse communities. And when we talk about mnemonic communities, we look at these wampum belts and we see how many different nations actually understood the symbols that were on the belts, and that this whole diplomatic metaphor reached and extended beyond the Great Lakes. And you see how many people are actually gathered here. This bottom one is Mantuaning, and they would estimate that there was anywhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people there from the all the way from North Bay to out to Lake Superior that would come and to the council fire. But here, this is the one that I guess I have to end at, is in Niagara, they had the fort. And this is at Fort Niagara, and it was Sir William Johnson who wrote this. And he met with the Mississaugas who were from the North Shore of Lake Ontario. And he says, "Brethren, the many belts of wampum and calumet of peace which hang in this room convince me of your and of the neighboring nations' good intentions, and the just sense which you all entertain of the blessings arising from peace and our friendship." And what he noted there is that the commander's room in the forts where conferences are held and where all the belts which the Indians deliver are hung up, end quote. So at each of these forts, the ones that I mentioned, like Fort Niagara, Fort Detroit, Amherstburg, Michilimackinac, had a commander's room. And then the different nations would come and they'd bring in pipes or they'd bring in wampum belts. And then these were pledges of alliance, and these were renewed annually or biannually. And each time they did that, it was of course ceremonial, and it was also to do with the council fire. So here, this is to show you that we actually did this on our own as well. We met and we had our own archives that was not tied to the government or colonial entities. This is a sampling of how those calumet stems looked and the pipes. So one last thing, I heard the bell, but I'm going to ignore it. So the commander's room at forts is mutual space between Indigenous people and colonial entities. That's a shared space. And what I showed you, what Andrew Blackbird said, was that they had all these pipes. The Odawa people kept all these pipes for different nations. That one is our space. And so this last quote is actually taken from a book called The Middle Ground by Richard White. And he said, "Before Joseph Brant and the Iroquois agreed to light a council fire at Brownstown," and remember that I told you to keep in mind Brownstown, "they demanded that the Hurons clearly separate themselves from the British. Although the Hurons were the eldest nation in the West and the ablest brethren we have in this quarter," quote, here's what he recorded that Brant had said, "we have never yet been able rightly to distinguish your fireplace. Whenever we, the Five Nations, come to you on private business, you introduced us to the English fire, when you should have had one under your own roofs. We therefore now brighten your fire, that we may see it at a distance. If you look upon yourselves as a free people, you should keep a fire of your own." So in the end, this is my concluding. In the end, I also advocate for funds to establish our own archives or our own fire. As mentioned, I am cognizant that I am in the Ontario Archives, an arm of the Ontario government that eschewed negotiation in order to appeal a court case that was won by the Anishinaabe. And this again is tied to the four tenets of imperialist thought. So miigwech gibes in the mekkine enchiak gibejayak nungo miigwech nui ngakke miigwech yakundok and kijik. So thank you all for taking the time to listen to me and indulging my 2 more minutes.
We actually do have time for some questions, if you're open to questions. For those of you on the virtual feed, you can put questions in the chats, and they'll be conveyed back to us. And Jay here in the room has a microphone if anyone has questions or comments from the room.
Nobody usually asks questions. So anyway. This is the Williams papers, which are housed here at the Ontario Archives, and part of this also is part of the Badash papers. They say potash papers, but Badash means he comes sailing this way, or he comes floating or flying this way, and that was a chief at Rice Lake. So they wrote down in Ojibwe what their understanding of the gunshot treaty is. And David McNabb, who used to work for the Ontario Ministry of whatever it was called back then, transcribed this. And so what I wanted to show is that, and this comes back to Cushman's, is that you actually need us. Because in his transcription, he once in a while he writes R's, and there are no R's in our language. So he's mistranscribed some of the words. But this would take somebody to go through this and really write it out, how we transliterate it to how we write today. And so this is, again, recontextualizing. And they actually have valuable information in this that we could use in our communities again. But if anybody thought of a question,
Just your belts that you have in England, have you ever tried to get those, repatriate them?
I haven't, because I'm not Wendat, but Marge will answer.
It's actually a very timely question, because the Pitt Rivers Museum and British Museum are currently initiating consultation with the tribal nations that their belts are related to. And ironically, because of the sale of those Wyandotte belts and the purchase by Horatio Hale, it's been presumed for nearly 2 centuries that they were no longer meaningful, and that they were no longer patrimonial, that they were simply owned by the chiefs who sold them. So we literally are, as we speak, initiating that new consultation.
Oh, there's one.
I'm from the Multicultural History Society of Ontario, and we're currently working with the Ojibwe and Cree Cultural Centre in Timmins on a collection of interviews, over 300 interviews that we, in a collaboration conducted in the late 1970s. These interviews have always been in the possession of the centre. Anyway, we're trying to develop culturally relevant metadata, describe the interviews from an Indigenous perspective, develop contextual materials that are from an Indigenous perspective. But it's still an exercise, I think, in repair to redress the harm done previously. So I wonder, obviously, the best course of action is Indigenous-run archives. But what do you think about collaborations?
I think they're necessary, and that was basically what I was saying, is that what I was trying to say is that Commander's Fort, there was a space for collaboration, and then but what I was saying, what Joseph Brandt had said, is that there actually needs also to be a place where it's just ours, and then part of this is political, and throughout my talk I referred to how the Ontario government is actually still taking us to court for this other court case, which we had won, and they appealed. So there is, we do want to collaborate, and we have to collaborate, basically because the majority of this material has been taken, sometimes illegally, and other times coercively purchased. And then, so we want to get this stuff back, but then like what I was trying to show here, and like this actual last document shows this as well, is that you could save this all you want and keep it, but you actually won't be able to understand it without us at this point. So that's the other thing is when you, and then also with these belts, there's a lot of different research that goes on and that is necessary to reconstitute that archive. So like that's why I started with that Wendat story, was because they were actually seen as the uncles and they were the ones to keep these international belts. But that doesn't mean that we didn't have our own belts. So there's Anishinaabe people, Odawa people that actually kept belts, and I know who those people were. But I was trying to show that we had, as a collective of different nations, our own archive as well, and that we actually needed that, and we actually feasted that, and we renewed that from time to time, and that it took many days to actually go through it, and as he said, overhaul it and put it in order. So that's the work that needs to be done. But we're in certain instances, there is room to collaborate because different collections have been made by the government. So whenever we've written in petition the Governor General or the Lieutenant Governor General or the Department, the Minister of Indian Affairs or the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, there's a copy here. So sometimes we, in our area in 1836, there was a treaty made for Manitoulin Island, and Sir Francis Bondhead was the Lieutenant Governor at the time, and he says, I entered into a treaty with them, and then I made it in duplicate. I enclosed one copy here for our records, and the other I left with the head chief there. But he didn't actually say which chief it was. And so I've been trying to see, well, who was it? I have a strong suspicion who it was, but and then whatever became of it. So I don't know where our copy of that treaty is. So that's the next part is, so we got to track a lot of these things down, whereas there actually is a copy already in these archives. So our archives got this dispersed, and then, but here, Ontario and Canada were able to keep an archive that we can still access and that we have to access at this point. So what I'm advocating is now, actually there is collaboration because basically it's funding. He's got all the money and also a lot of the know-how. And what we need to do is we need you to collaborate with us to empower us to build up our archive in this new digital world. Because we could still keep going how we're going and to strengthen that. But there are other things that I personally would like to put into an archive. And when I worked for the Chiging First Nation, I recorded a bunch of elders too. And we have those on our website. And I translated and I transcribed what the elders said in Ojibwe. And then, so we are already building up our archive. So a number of different times we've been asked, the University of Alberta actually brought us all together maybe that's probably 10 years ago. And the University of Alberta wanted to make a centralized archive for Indigenous languages for all of Canada. And so they brought a bunch of language workers from across Canada together. And then it was a good idea, but it blew up. And the reason it blew up was a lot of people had bad experiences with archives. And basically what I kind of was one of the ones that kind of put the first nail in the coffin, and or the first shot that did the first cut or whatever. And it was because we have had our archives in the Ojibwe Culture Foundation where I used to work, and we were never able to actually get them digitized because we didn't have our funding request got turned down. And then it just sounded galling to me that I would then send that all over to a university 3 or 4 provinces over to get digitized, and then they store it, and then I don't have access anymore, direct access, and then I'm at their whim of when I'm actually going to access that. So I said, and they had different models, and I just said, no, we want to be able to control this ourselves, and for our elders to access and our students to access, that they come to us, not to you. So that was basically, there's collaboration, you could help us do that, but it doesn't mean that you would end up owning everything or being the gatekeeper again. And that's what we're going against. Are you?
Sorry, Dr. Corbiere, I'm not sure if you've. I have a question from the webcast audience.
Okay.
Jay, is this one? Yep. Okay, so we have a question from Trevor Holmes, who's at the University of Waterloo, and he says, I'm interested in the act of transcription as non-neutral. Typically, my students type what they see / what they can decipher of white women's diaries, etc., and see their role as neutral. But with transcription across languages and cultures, you point out the problems of transliteration. Is there a non-extractive way to set up the partnerships between classroom-based transcribing assignments and language speakers inside and outside an institution without burning out the language speaker partners? Number one answer for me would be pay the Indigenous collaborators, but there are complicated questions to address beyond that. And he also says, thank you so much for your sharing today and your work.
That's the thing, what he mentioned about the burnout. And where the people that can do this kind of work are rare. So, and then you got to pay them. So that's the other thing. And it is a bottleneck. So the idea that what I've been trying to do, and the short answer is no. That, but what I've been trying to do is actually get more people that are able to transcribe an interview. And we got quite a bit of language, Anishinaabe language programs, and that this should actually, and we actually got a lot of students that take linguistics, and it seems like to me that it shouldn't be so hard to actually get them to work on transcribing elder interviews. But it seems like the linguists that are teaching the courses get them to transcribe different things rather than collaborate with an institution like the Woodland Cultural Center or the Ojibwe Culture Foundation or any other institution that actually is trying to build a corpus of material and to build that on an online archive. So actually, I'm hoping that when I get working, that I'm able to hire students, and then it's basically a process of workflow. So sometimes, to answer his question, what I find sometimes is people bring the language speaker in too early, and then they burn them out because they're asking them for every little thing. So myself, like, I don't know if he has facility with the language he's working with, but myself, I liken it to when, although I was the executive director at the Ojibwe Culture Foundation, and I said that it entailed roles as curator and historian, I actually was the director of snow removal as well. And setting up chairs and putting away chairs. And so when I would shovel the walkway, some people just go right through, do one pass, and then clean it up. Others actually go along and make it nice and clean all the way till they get to the end of the driveway. So that's two ways of how I look at it when you're doing a transcription. Is what I do when I do transcription, I go right through and I have all these different mistakes or where I'm unclear, and I just use square brackets there to indicate that I need to ask the elder if this is, or the speaker if this is right or wrong. And then once I go through with them, then I find I don't tax them as much because I do that first clear pass. Whereas I think what others are doing is they actually go with them and sit there with them to try and do it together. And I think if you actually sit there as a student of the language trying to pick it up and learn, then you actually get more out of it by actually spending more time with it and then complementing or supplementing that time with the elder speaker and then referring. Now there's all these online dictionaries as well that help and different tools. when I first started, there was nothing like that. It was all books. So I think it's a workflow process to try and alleviate there.
Thank you. Thank you very much.